There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, and I have a question. Do you believe in ghosts? I know, it's a bit of a weird question, but stay with me. Journalist Tristan Redman didn't believe in ghosts. And it's strange, really, that he was such a skeptic, given what had happened in his childhood bedroom. And it turns out it wasn't just Tristan who had some unexplainable experiences in that room, in that house in England. There was another family who lived in the same house who had similar stories.
Could this really just be coincidence? What's really going on? Have we definitively found proof of the afterlife? Like, your mind starts running away with you.
That room and the upstairs area in which it was situated in this very ordinary suburban house on an ordinary street really did seem to be haunted. And that's not even the most interesting part of this story, because what happened next was the most stunning coincidence. As an adult, Tristan met his now wife, Kate Dancy. The Dancy family are quite fancy. They're fancy Dancies. For example, her brother Hugh is a famous British actor. He was in The Good Place, Law and Order, and the TV series Elizabeth, and he's married to Claire Danes. Anyway, you know that haunted house that Tristan grew up in? Well, his wife's great-grandmother was murdered next door. I told you it was a big coincidence, or was it a coincidence? Could all of this have something to do with the ghost of Tristan's childhood? Well, the more Tristan dug, the more questions that he had, not just about the paranormal and about ghosts, but about the murder itself.
It's possible that there was some jealousy between Feather and Naomi. You know, Feather's a guy who his career was not going as well as he might have hoped, and she was enormously successful. Now, although there is no evidence of jealousy between them, you have to wonder to what extent he found it difficult having a wife who outshone him to such a great extent.
So, of course, he made a podcast.
You now have three completely unconnected families who have had some sort of strange, inexplicable experience on the top floor of that house. I think it's wonderful.
A lot of people have been obsessed with this podcast. Jesse Stevens, Holly Wainwright and I spoke about it on Out Loud. And Jesse had the opportunity to sit down with him for this very special, a little bit spooky, No Filter episode. And she got him to tell her his remarkable story. He talked about the ghost of a faceless woman, a murder plot, and how he went to see psychic mediums, and how he chose to keep investigating this story, despite it causing enormous stress and friction within his family.
If you come out with a piece that says he was a murderer, then I will be sorry that we ever said we would contribute to it.
Just a heads up, this story does include mention of suicide. Here is Tristan Redman, interviewed by Jesse Stevens.
When you were a little boy, you lived in a house where some pretty strange things happened. Can you remember the first time you thought your house might be haunted?
I lived in that house from when I was 16 years old, and the thing that happened to me was things used to move around my bedroom. So I lived in this little room on the top floor of the house, kind of under the eaves. It was one of those tall, thin kind of London houses. And I guess I noticed that things would move around the room. So there was specifically a vase. It was like a yellow vase. I know it's a bit weird that I had a yellow vase in my room as a teenager, but my mum put it there. I'm not sure why. I think she just used to put things in my room that she didn't want in the house anymore. It lived on, there was like a little mantelpiece, and I would notice that it would pitch up in different places around the room. So it would be on the bedside table, and then I'd come back later, it would be on the desk, and then I'd come back later, it would be on this little table. And over a period of months, I noticed that for some reason I kept on having to put this thing back. So it wasn't like one moment, and I never saw it like move around the room, like fly through the air or anything like that. Like, you'd know about it if that were the case, definitely.
And you make it sound very matter of fact, but if that were me as a teenager, it would have really crept me out. Like, were you scared by that kind of activity?
No, because my thought, you don't immediately think, oh my God, it's paranormal activity. You think, this is weird. Why does this thing keep moving around? I think over years, My family lived in that house for about 10 years, but I was off at university and coming back and going away and all that kind of thing. And over years, I would start to ask my sister, who also lived on the top floor, I'd say to her, like, are you moving stuff around the room? Like, are you messing with me? And she would say no. And then eventually she basically just said, stop asking me whether I'm moving stuff around your room. Like, I'm not, just give it up. And then my family moved out in 2006. By then I'd kind of moved out and left home anyway, but they sold the house and I just didn't think about it ever again, really, until much, much, much later.
And as you say, you didn't think about it for years. And then you had, I believe it was a neighbour who's a bit of a gossip, had a bit of a chat to you about someone who had come to visit. What did they say?
So this was like a couple of years ago. By this stage, we had been out of the house. My family had been out of the house for almost 15 years. And I was actually at work one morning and I got an email from my dad who was passing on to me a message that he had had from a former neighbor of ours who's a good family friend still. And he's like a kind of local historian type of guy. And he was researching an exhibition for the local museum about the neighborhood. And he was actually knocking on doors, raising money for the exhibition and talking to locals about his exhibition. And he knocked on my old front door. And he heard this story about how the people who lived in the house after us had been experiencing some strange things in the house. And the woman who owned the house told him that not only they, but the people who had lived in the house just before them had also experienced strange things in the house. And therefore he contacted my dad and said, you know, does this ring any bells? And my dad said, I don't know, that was Tristan's room, the one at the top of the house. So I'll ask him. So I'm sitting at work and I get this email ping up from my dad saying, like, does this ring any bells? At this point, I hadn't thought about any of this in like 15 years. And it immediately came rushing back to me. I was like, I know exactly what he's talking about. And that was what I wrote back to him and said, you know, the vase, stuff moving around. We used to joke about it. I used to, you know, blame my sister. And that was how this all started. Because then, like, once I found out about the other families, we're 3 families at this point who've all experienced strange things in the top of the house. Then you start asking yourself loads of questions. It's like, could this really just be coincidence? What's really going on? Have we definitively found proof of the afterlife? Like, your mind starts running away with you. And that was how this whole process started. And I went from like 0 to 60 in, you know, 0.3 seconds of being like someone who had zero interest in ghosts whatsoever to someone who was thinking about ghosts morning, noon, and night every day. And that's kind of been where I've been for the last 2 years. You
interviewed one of the women who used to live in that house about what she experienced. What specifically did she say about, I think she was upstairs. What sort of things happened to her while living in that house?
So we met one of the women who slept on the top floor. She's called Sonia, and she is a singer-songwriter who lives in London. And so she lived actually in my sister's room, which was next door. And she told a story about when her family moved into the house. So this had been within a year after my family had left. And she's lying in bed at night. It's like 2 a.m, and she notices that the window has blown open in the middle of the night. So she gets up, she closes the window. She thinks that's odd because that's never happened before. But she gets back into bed and she says that she senses the bed starting to shake.
I woke up because my bed was shaking, but not just shaking like even shaking. It was shaking like vigorously and then slower and then faster again, like shake, 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 shake.
And I was like, all right, are you sure you weren't maybe just asleep or something and imagining this? And she was like, no, absolutely not. There's no way I was asleep. And she says the bed started shaking quite violently, and then softly, and then violently, and then softly. And this went on for quite a while. And her initial thought was, are my parents downstairs having sex? Because, you know, is this house like really old and rickety and I can feel it up here, because her room was immediately above her parents' room. And then she said that she felt like her leg was coming out from underneath the covers and pushing away an invisible force that was almost like trying to get on top of her. And the bed shaking kept on going on, and then it subsided, and then she felt like, she described it as like an impression of a person in the bed to the right of her, as though, there was like a person who was there that was, depressing the mattress. And if she'd sort of rolled over, she would have fallen into the depression. And she said that she kind of curled up and waited, and it all went away. And then it happened again about 20 minutes later. Same kind of experience. And then she said that she felt the very strong feeling of somebody in the room watching her. And what really struck me was she said she had this sense that the person's name began with the letter J. And then the next morning, she went down to breakfast and she saw her mum, and she said to her mum, "Were you and Dad having sex last night?" And her mum was like, no, not at all. Why? And she told her mum the story, and that was it, really. Like, she was totally, on the one hand, quite freaked out by it, but on the other hand, quite calm about it.
You describe yourself as a skeptic, and that's something that runs through the podcast. When you hear a story like that, we heard that woman's voice. She sounds pretty credible. Do you believe her?
I don't know. It's difficult, it's difficult when you're sitting opposite somebody and they are telling you a story which is so vivid and looking you straight in the eye. Like, I have no reason to disbelieve this person. I'm really torn about it. I have to say, one of the things I do notice, myself included in all this, is that so many of the people who tell these stories are teenagers. And I wonder about what it is about being a teenager which leads you to be maybe more susceptible to this stuff than if you are 45 with 2 children or whatever. The thing I've learned over the course of all this is not to dismiss this stuff out of hand, to listen to what people are saying to you, because it means something to them, and therefore it's important to take seriously in that respect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and your story had paranormal elements, but there are also some pretty significant coincidences. Your wife, for example, you met her and she saw the place where you had lived. Her family saw the place you had lived, and they sort of recognized the street. What was that coincidence that brought your two families together in that way?
Yeah, so when I met my wife, Kate, at university, we had no idea, she had no idea that her family had any link whatsoever to the neighborhood in London where my family was living. We met at university in Scotland. When we first started going out, she came to stay for a bit with my family. And totally randomly, her grandfather came round for lunch on a Sunday. She was very close to her grandfather. He happened to be passing through town. He came round. He had no idea where he was going. He turned up, got out of the car, came into the front door. And the first thing he said was, "My mother was murdered in the house next door." And I had no idea of this story. Kate had heard the story before, but had no idea of the location. And we sat down to lunch and he told us the story, which was basically that in 1937, his mother had been murdered by her brother, so his uncle, while she slept in bed at night. She was shot in each eye as she slept. And his father, who's a man known in the family as Father, which is a kind of, nickname. Father was in the house at the time. He was in the room next door in the study writing a letter. And he survived. He heard gunshots. He went out onto the landing and saw his brother-in-law emerging from his bedroom where his wife had been asleep. His brother-in-law was holding a revolver. He leveled the revolver at Father and walked towards him as though he was going to shoot him. At the last minute, Father switched off the light in the landing, ducked down. The brother-in-law, Morris, shot from the revolver. The round missed him, went out the back window. And then Morris, the brother-in-law, locked himself in the lavatory, which was on the landing. And then there was a kind of altercation between Father and Morris inside the lavatory. And eventually Morris cut his own throat and died inside the lavatory. Father knocked down the door and found his brother-in-law dead inside the lavatory, went into the bedroom and saw his wife dead, and then called the cops. And that's the kind of official story of the murder. I mean, it was pretty traumatic. The police arrived, interviewed Father in the house. There was a housekeeper who was asleep upstairs who didn't really hear anything, took testimony from her. And then within a few days, the coroner ruled that it was a murder-suicide, where the brother-in-law, Morris, who was kind of imbalanced PTSD sufferer from the First World War, not uncommon for those days, was ruled the killer of his sister, Naomi, and himself. And that was kind of it. It was a big story in the press in the late 1930s in Britain. It was reported all over the world in the United States, I think probably even in Australia. And the thing that captivated people was really the story of this beautiful woman doctor, Naomi Dancy, who was very rare for her time in that she was quite prominent as a doctor. She was a public health official in London. And the brutality of her murder, I think, really sort of seized people's attention as well. But as we explore in the podcast in some great detail, there are some significant doubts over what actually happened in the killing, and there are reasons to be suspicious of my wife's great-grandfather.
Can you tell me a little bit about Morris and what the evidence was against him? Why that was so quick for them to decide he did it?
Morris was a war hero. He was an officer in the First World War at the Battle of the Somme, and he was very highly decorated for digging 5 of his men out from being buried up by a shell. He dug them out under heavy fire at the risk of his own life, and he was given the Military Cross for it. And then about 10 days, 2 weeks later, he was blown up on the battlefield and, quote unquote, left for dead. And somehow he survived. No one knows how. I think they just scooped him up and thought he was dead, and, he somehow survived. Went back to Britain with his face blown apart. They tried to send him back to the front. And he said, I can't go and fight again because I only have one eye. And the doctor he said this to said, one eye these days is considered a luxury. So he was going to be packed off to fight again, and someone intervened and kept him in England. And he led quite a troubled life in the 1920s and 30s. And by the time of the murder in 1937, he was still suffering from PTSD, or shell shock as it was known at the time. He was drinking very heavily, and his life was kind of falling apart. So it was easy to blame him for what happened in the house that night with the murder. Because I have to say that the physical evidence against him, there isn't very much of it. The only physical evidence that he committed the murder were the hesitation wounds on his neck. Now, hesitation wounds are what happens sometimes in a suicidal neck cut. If you are going to cut your neck, you probably don't do it in one fell swoop. Like, you might sort of have a couple of attempts. And the pathologist ruled that there were wounds on his neck which seemed to match that, attempts to do it. It's very standard for someone who was cutting their neck to do that. But there isn't really any other physical evidence that he did this. There are no fingerprints, there's no blood spatter, there's obviously no DNA evidence, no witnesses. The only witness is Father, who's also a suspect. So really, he was deemed to have done it because he was a shell-shocked, unbalanced, alcoholic guy. And, in the late 1930s, this is a moment in British history where society's kind of getting fed up with shell-shocked, unbalanced, alcoholic veterans. This is the sad truth. It's 20 years after the First World War, and maybe Morris was just a very easy person to blame. On the other hand, you have a respectable family doctor. No one really wants to blame the respectable family doctor in the circumstances.
Father almost had a bit of a public profile at that time and had become such a legend in the family of your wife. What did they know about him? What was the story that had been passed on through generations?
So when I first heard about the murder in 2003, Father was kind of the founding father of the family, right? He was a sort of swashbuckling, intellectual, former spy, musician, magician, general kind of man of adventure. And he was known in the family for having, a kind of encyclopedia of exciting tall tales that he would trot out on occasions. And the family that I married into, the Dancys, they are a sort of very impressive bunch. There are academics in there. My father-in-law is a quite well-known philosopher in that world. My brother-in-law is a well-known actor. They're, in some respects, quite an intimidating family to marry into. And Father was the founding father of all of this. He's a guy that everyone looked up to. He died in 1976, so I never met him. But to poke around in that corner of family history was a tricky thing to do because of the respect in which he's held in the family to this day.
On the surface, that story of what happened that night appears to make sense. You've got someone who, has PTSD from war, and the evidence seemed very open and shut. What were some of the cracks that began to emerge for you that made you think this is worth looking at a little more closely?
So a couple of days after the murder, there were some anonymous letters that were sent to the police. They were sent from around London, handwritten letters that were in the police file that basically said, look closely at the husband. Those were the first things that came up, and we were like, what the hell's going on there? But then you start to see, as you look into the police file, some odd bits of evidence that the police don't really seem to investigate. One of them is that when the police arrive, they find Maurice Tribe's body in the lavatory. So he is the dead brother-in-law. And Maurice Tribe is holding a razor blade in his hand, which is supposedly what he has used to cut his own throat. But when Fayther gives his testimony to the police, he says that as I knocked the door down into the lavatory, the razor blade fell from his hand. So the police go back and check this, and they obviously say, you said that it fell from his hand. How come it was in his hand when we found him? And he says, oh, well, I put it back in his hand. And nobody seems to ask why he does this. And there are a number of strange details like this that crop up that make you think, hang on, what's going on here? There's another one, which is that he says that he washes his brother-in-law's hands of blood before calling the ambulance. So he seems to be like tampering with bits of evidence at the crime scene. And there are potentially some anodyne explanations for all this. Some people have suggested that he might have washed his brother-in-law's hands out of a sort of sense of hygiene, which might or might not happen in a hospital setting, because he was a doctor himself. But none of these explanations seem to make that much sense. But then you find out some other details, like just before the murder, he has taken out a new life insurance policy on his wife, like literally within a week, 10 days before the murder. And then you find out that shortly after the murder, he gets together with someone else, a woman who lives just down the road, who's a nurse. And then within about a year of the murder, he gets married to her. And you start to wonder what's really going on here.
And Fayther's police statement that he gave them after the incident, what exactly did that say? It obviously gave a bit of a timeline about the account, but what kind of made police believe that account, do you think?
When I read that account, I see a lot of things in it which are unbelievable. And so I think above all, the thing which made police believe him was that he was a doctor who was well respected. But he basically, in that statement, he gives an account from like 10 days beforehand right up to the night of the murder. And it starts off with, like he says, my brother-in-law was an alcoholic. He was basically stumbling around London, getting drunk at 7 a.m. He gets knocked over by a car or a bus in the street, and he can't really walk properly anymore. So he's sort of painting the picture of a guy whose life is really falling apart. And then he starts telling the story of the day of the actual murder, where he, Fayther goes to pick Maurice up at his house. There's this extraordinary scene where Maurice retreats into his bedroom to get his things, and Fayther is waiting in the kitchen for Maurice to come out, and he hears filing or sawing behind the closed door. And he eventually says, come on, Maurice, we've got to go. And they get into the car, and Maurice has got, a bag full of clinking bottles, which just all seems too sort of convenient. The filing or sawing apparently is because the bullets were manipulated. They were made dum-dum, it's called. So you cut like crosses in the ends of the bullets. But it just seems so far-fetched to me, the idea that you were planning to murder your sister in a fit of pique. And, 8 hours beforehand, you decided to saw crosses in the bullets in such a way that your brother-in-law could hear you doing it. And then later on, you go and have an argument. And then in, a fit of passion, you decide that, you're going to murder your sister. But 8 hours beforehand, you prepared the bullets to do it. Like the whole thing just doesn't really make any sense. So, yeah, that's kind of what the police report gives us, is like this account of the day, which leads into this argument at night. And then Fayther writing his letter and then hearing at 1 o'clock in the morning his wife being shot in the room next door by Morris. And then there's all sorts of stuff which is found on the crime scene, like in Morris's room, there is this kind of tableau of damning evidence. So, there's like some cocaine, there's a bottle of methylated spirits, there are some pornographic postcards. And there's a detective novel called Murder in the House. One of the detectives we spoke to said, this guy could barely see. Like, how is he reading this novel called Murder in the House? So there are all these sort of bits of evidence which are kind of assembled, which all seem rather convenient. Like you would have thought that it would all be a bit chaotic and no one would really understand at the moment of the murder what had actually happened. But Fayther tells this very linear story about, the 10 days leading up to the murder. One of the detectives we spoke to said, when they see a linear story like that, they're immediately suspicious of it, because human beings don't tell stories like that. They'll be like, okay, so, I went here and then, oh yeah, then this happened beforehand and I forgot to tell you, and then that happened and then that, and like, it doesn't have like a neat order to it. Whereas the story that Fayther tells does, like it's all building up to this one moment where the murder happens, and then the murder happens and that's all he kind of says about it. So the statement's very weird.
Up next, Jesse asks Tristan about a really big red flag when he was looking into Naomi's murder.
Anytime you see an insurance policy taken out of someone's life just before they die or just before they're murdered, red flags, red flags, red flags. That's, majorly suspicious.
And also what happened when he went to see some psychic mediums to help him solve this case. Stay with us.
In terms of a potential motive for Fayther, you sort of mentioned the insurance papers. Can you speak to that a bit more? So what was it about those that suggested, he might have been responsible or he might have benefited from the death of his wife?
So a new life insurance policy was taken out on Naomi's life in the week before the murder for £5,000, which was a lot of money at the time. And as one of the cops we spoke to on the detective panel said to us, like anytime you see an insurance policy taken out of someone's life just before they die or just before they're murdered, red flags, red flags, red flags. That's, majorly suspicious. The cops at the time barely look into it. They make some cursory attempts to speak to the insurance company and say, any idea what's going on here? The insurance company refused to go on the record and answer any questions about it. But, there's this rather complicated scenario where Morris had previously taken out an insurance policy on Naomi's life as a kind of amateur insurance agent. He'd basically sorted out her life insurance. And the policy that he had taken out for Naomi was coming to an end and Fayther was taking out a new one. So there's this rather complicated situation where at the time of Naomi's death, you actually have 2 life insurance policies out on her. There's like a window of about a week where both life insurance policies are open. So her death at that particular moment is potentially quite lucrative for Fayther because he's the beneficiary on both accounts. I mean, the other motives are, potential motives, I should say, is this second wife of Fayther's that, he marries just a year after the murder. And one of the things that we discovered in the course of our investigation was that we didn't really have any idea about who this second wife was. We just knew that she was a lot younger and that she was a nurse. And one of the things that really surprised us was that she appears on the scene very, very quickly after the murder. So less than 2 weeks after Naomi is dead is the first mention we see of her in the letters that are written by Fayther to the children at school. And, initially she just pops up as somebody he's seeing a lot of, and she's being very helpful. But we've never heard her mentioned until that point. And then, the fact that he marries her so soon afterwards is quite concerning as a possible motive. But the third thing is that this is something that the family told us about, was that it's possible that there was some jealousy between Fayther and Naomi. Fayther's a guy who His career was not going as well as he might have hoped. He was sort of semi-retired by the time of the murder, and she was enormously successful. And, you know, as some members of the family said to us, they could think of lots of reasons why, you know, Fayther would want to be taken seriously. Now, although there is no evidence of jealousy between them, you know, in the family letters we've read, he seems to write very affectionately about her. He, at the same time, does come across as a man who, maybe having an inferiority complex is saying too much, but he definitely feels a strong need to impress. And you have to wonder to what extent he found it difficult having a wife who outshone him to such a great extent. But, you know, none of these are concrete motives. Like so much in this story, you think you can see something, but then when you look closer, is any of that enough for you to justify killing your wife in cold blood? When, you know, hitherto you've not shown any signs of violence towards her or anything like that. Like, are you really going to murder your wife for £5,000?
Yeah.
It's not clear to me, you know? It's difficult to get a handle on.
You took all of this evidence to a bunch of detectives to see what they made of it. What was their interpretation?
We spoke to 8 detectives, and 7 of them told us that they believed that Fayther was the main suspect in the case, if not actually guilty in their opinion.
Dr. Dancy did it.
Dr. John Dancy has a clear motive.
For me, there seems to be only one person who does gain in this scenario.
I would say he was absolutely involved.
And that's Dr. Dancy.
Nobody knows for sure, but John.
I believe it was homicide by Dr. Dancy.
One of the detectives we spoke to, who was possibly the most qualified of all of them, said that he believed that the police at the time got it right.
And you then have to present these theories or the digging that you are doing to your in-laws, essentially. How did they take that when you said, actually, I've looked a little bit more closely and this revered man in your family might not be who you thought he was?
Well, some of those conversations were extremely challenging. We spoke with different members of the family, you know, over the course of about 3 or 4 months. And some people said, okay, that doesn't surprise me at all. I never put too much credit in that story of the murder. I would believe any interpretation of what actually happened. Some people were distrustful of the man from the start because they saw him as a guy who told tall tales and something didn't seem quite right. But then there were other members of the family who took it very badly. It was really hard because he was such a totemic figure for them and for what the family is today. And those conversations were difficult. There was a lot of discussion of why I was actually doing this, what was motivating me, which are all, fair questions. And we had a lot of conversation as well about, journalistic bias. Like, for example, what it means if you go to a detective and say, have a look at this case, please, and tell me what you think. Isn't the natural inclination of that person to assume that you are asking them to overturn what had previously been decided? Otherwise, why would you be asking? Which is a very reasonable question. So it's been really hard. I think initially when we first spoke to people in the family and said, what does this all mean to you? People said, oh, well, it was so far in the past, it doesn't really matter. And then when it actually came down to it, having these conversations, I was really stunned by the extent to which it really still does matter, even though this murder happened almost 100 years ago. It was really challenging.
If this was one of your ancestors, if this was your grandfather or your great-grandfather, and it was being suggested that he might have done something awful, do you think you would have feelings about that? Do you think you'd be connected to that outcome? That's
a question I have mulled over and asked myself hundreds and hundreds of times. It's impossible to say, I think, until you're actually in that situation. My instinctive answer is to say that if my grandfather were a murderer, or there was evidence to suggest that my grandfather were a murderer, I would want to know. I'd be fascinated. I would want to know every single detail. I would throw myself into it and ask a million questions. But that's easy to say because I'm not in that position. So, when I went to my in-laws and said, here's some evidence which suggests that your grandfather or great-grandfather may have been a murderer, they didn't always react that way. I mean, a couple of them did. I don't know. What do you think?
I guess it says something about who you are, and maybe we don't realise how much it informs our sense of self and where we came from, that there are legends passed down through families, and maybe we're holding on a lot tighter than we think. Because even the stories Father had told about his life, and you said he told some tall tales, and some people suspected he was maybe making them up, but you were able to debunk basically, his life story that he had told generations in terms of what he did. There was some line about him being a spy, and that wasn't true. Like, how did you unpick all of that maybe he had almost fictionalized his life?
Well, I mean, I guess to say that he told tall tales would be a massive under-exaggeration. He told massively big whoppers about who he actually was. He wrote an almost 3,000-word memoir about his life, which he wrote in the 60s and 70s before he died. And it seems like most of the 3,000 pages are not true. He tells this story about basically being a spy in the First World War in the early days of MI5 and MI6. And he writes in great detail about going to spy school and learning the tradecraft of being a spy and then being sent on missions. And it seems like none of it was actually true. Basically, the family sent the memoirs to some academics in the 1980s at Cambridge University. And the academics were very excited about these memoirs because there was very little primary source documentation about the early days of MI5 and MI6. And they spent months looking at these memoirs and eventually came to the conclusion that, this was all invented and plagiarized, or a lot of it was anyway. And, his life is just a series of these kind of untruths, like even really basic stuff. Like one of his foundation stories is about his days studying at Cambridge University in the early 1900s. There's no record of him whatsoever at Cambridge University. He tells this sort of vivid story about going to Gallipoli on a ship, leaving Marseille in France, and then the ship sinking. And the ship is called the SS Liban. I wasn't able to find any record of the SS Liban sinking at the time that it was supposed to have sunk in 1915. And then I looked a little bit further and found out that a ship called the SS Liban sank about 10 years earlier coming out of Marseille. There are massive whoppers like this. He says he was at Anzac Cove in Gallipoli in 1915. I couldn't find any record of his regiment being there. And then you start to wonder what is motivating all these lies. And you start to see lies which seem to map on to details from the actual murder. So if he committed the murder, it means that he would have cut his brother-in-law's throat himself. So he would have knocked down the lavatory door, gone in, cut his brother-in-law's throat. And in the memoirs, he gives a vivid account of being taught how to cut someone's throat at spy school during the First World War. He has a class called the butchery class, in which a doctor recruits through how to, commit various ways of killing people. And then you find out that probably none of this ever happened. And you think, what on earth is motivating you to tell a story about learning how to cut someone's throat when later in life there is some evidence which suggests that you might have actually done that? It's very difficult to understand. And it becomes a story in many ways about why we tell the stories we tell about ourselves to make ourselves look better or feel better about ourselves, individually and as a family.
There's a question, I suppose, about if he was guilty, if this was something that he did, and the family asked you this, sort of what the motivation was. Because in terms of justice, he is dead. Everyone involved is dead. Justice can't necessarily be served. What was the motivation? Was it curiosity? Was it a sense that it was unresolved? What do you think drove you in terms of wanting to work out this puzzle?
Okay, well, that's a big question in the sense that it kind of evolved over time. It started off being a curiosity, like I wanted to find out more about the ghost in the house, whether there was some link between the ghost in the room that I grew up in and the murder in the house next door, because somebody who slept in my room said that she saw a faceless woman appear to her. And of course, Naomi Dancy in the house next door was shot in the face. So it was sort of driven by this curiosity about a ghost, which I admit is a purely frivolous thing. But then it evolved over time into having a feeling that maybe there was an injustice which had been committed, a double injustice, in the sense that Morris Tribe may have been accused of doing something that he didn't do, and that his reputation has been destroyed for all this time. And he probably was, if that's the case, is a man who didn't deserve this, because he was a war hero himself. And he's remembered as a man who killed his sister and then himself. But also an injustice that Naomi Dancy, who is my wife's great-grandmother, has been almost entirely forgotten and erased from history. Because the family story, which has been told since 1937, when the murder happened, was that Naomi was shot in the eyes, and then that's kind of the last we ever hear from her. And then the story has become about Fedor and his, sparkling accomplishments and what a wonderful man he was. And I think what's motivated me is to try to understand that a little bit better, why he deserves to be remembered and she doesn't. Because, as we've already discussed, he's a guy who told a lot of grandiose lies about his life, and she was a woman who really deserved to be remembered. She was a pioneering doctor. She was way ahead of her time in terms of teaching people about sexual health and looking after children and bringing up children. She had some really kind of forward-thinking ideas about all these things for the 1920s and 1930s. And she was a bit of a star in her day. She was the family breadwinner. He didn't work by the time the 1930s came around. She was a well-known public figure, and she's been totally forgotten. And while I wouldn't say that I was on a kind of crusading mission to, totally change the family narrative, that would be too much, I was nonetheless kind of driven by this nagging feeling that there was something that was not quite right there. And that by trying to get a little bit closer to the truth, we might be able to rectify that a bit.
Stick around, because Tristan talks about what happened when he brought a psychic medium to the actual house where Naomi was murdered.
You're standing there on a landing and you're thinking, that's the bedroom where she died. That's the study where Fedor was writing his letters. That's the window where the bullet went out the back. And it is pretty overwhelming.
And Jesse also asks Tristan what his relationship with his in-laws is like now after all of this digging.
There were so many unknowns. Even when examining the evidence, you're still left with these questions. So you decided, as a skeptic, to try and source some paranormal experts, I will call them. As a skeptic, when you're sitting there, I guess, interviewing people for that sort of job, do you believe them at all? Or do you think that they're con artists, or do you think they believe what they're saying?
I still don't have an answer on that one. So we went through a process of meeting as many psychic mediums as we could around London. And the idea was that we were going to select one who seemed to be good and take them to the house where the murder happened to try and get a little bit closer to the truth about the murder and the truth about the ghost in my childhood bedroom. And we met 4 or 5, I think, psychic mediums in one day on this kind of madcap paranormal goose chase around London. And I went into it totally skeptical. And I was not prepared to give any of them the time of day. And then by the end of the day, I was quite disturbed by how much it started to affect me. Now, I don't know how much that was because you're not supposed to meet 4 or 5 different psychic mediums in one day. And that would be enough to send anyone a bit doolally. But I guess there came certain moments where I couldn't tell what the trick was anymore, or if it was even a trick, or whether they actually were able to kind of see something. And then you double check and you force yourself to not take them seriously. And then your mind is spinning and you don't know what to do anymore. I think the answer is, with a little bit of hindsight, that you can be bamboozled by these people because they're quite skillful at what they do. And to maintain your composure is not always possible. I think there is definitely a skill there, but I'm not sure that it is a supernatural skill.
So you did go back, well, you went to that house, the house next door where it happened. Did you get any weird feelings when you were in that environment? You'd studied it so hard and you knew what had happened there. How did you feel when you're in that environment?
I felt incredibly weird feelings going into that house because I'd spent at this stage like 18 months thinking about the inside of that house, morning, noon and night. And just to be in the space where the murder had happened was kind of overwhelming, actually. I had an idea of the layout anyway, because one of the strange things I should point out about this story is that the house that I grew up in just next door has exactly the same layout as the house where the murder happened. It's one of those London, rows of houses where the houses are all the same. So when I was thinking about this murder for like 18 months, I was always picturing it inside my own house, the house that I grew up in. So, when I was thinking about Naomi lying in the bed and being shot, I was thinking about her lying in my parents' room downstairs. Or when I was thinking about, Morris and Father, shouting at each other through the door, I was thinking about them, on the shower room on our old landing. So I already knew what the house was like. But when I went into the actual house where the murder was, it was an almost kind of cosmic experience, because you're standing there on a landing and you're thinking, that's the bedroom where she died. That's the study where Father was writing his letters. That's the window where the bullet went out the back. And it is pretty overwhelming. But the interesting thing for me was that I was working with my producer colleague, Annie Brown, who was my kind of reporting partner on the whole story. And she came at it from a very different point of view, which was that this is just a house. History is history. It happened then. And she saw no significance in the actual just being in the premises, even though she'd been as obsessed with the murder as I had. And she was able to remain very detached about the whole thing and the location. And I was both confused by that and impressed in a sense. I guess some people are more impressed by historical locations than others.
Did you feel like when you were all there and you did have sort of this person that claimed to be a conduit to the other side, did you feel like any contact was made with any of these people that you'd been looking at?
I would say something definitely happened, in the sense of, not in the sense of ghosts and spirits, because I still don't believe in that stuff. The process that we went through of a group of people coming together in a room, sitting in a circle on the carpet and thinking very intensely and intently about what had happened in that room and the people who were involved, that had an important effect. It sort of brought some peace to the situation, just the moment of contemplation that we all had together, and made me feel calmer about this thing that had been disturbing me for 2 years. And so I guess even though I don't believe that the spirits were there in the room with us, and I don't believe that a psychic medium was talking to the dead from the other side, I did come to kind of accept that that process had a purpose, and that maybe I shouldn't be so cynical about it. And that if doing something like this meant something to some people, then that is worthy of respect and acceptance. And different strokes, different folks, right? And I guess you can extend that metaphor to all sorts of things. If your church is going to church, that's not my thing, but I respect you for it. If your church is going to watch baseball or football and that's how you find peace, I respect you for it. If your church is speaking to psychic mediums, okay, I think you might be being scammed, but if that's what you need to find the peace that you get, then I respect that too. And I suppose that's the journey that I've been on.
So you had the psychic medium at the seance. Who did they say came through for you that day?
So that was one of the last questions that we asked. And I was kind of surprised to hear him say that the person who has been appearing in my old bedroom has absolutely no link whatsoever with the death of my wife's great-grandmother in the house next door.
It's a totally another woman. It's just different energy. Yeah, it was separate. I'm feeling separate occurrences, separate set of paranormal activity there with its own history and story behind it.
Which was quite a funny moment, I suppose, because having spent 2 years thinking about all this, that was a bit deflating, but in a good way. And my two producer colleagues who were in the room at the time basically both rolled their eyes and said, "Great, thanks a lot, Tristan. A for effort. That was brilliant. Thanks for making us spend all this time doing that." So that was his answer. But, I take some of those answers with a pinch of salt. So make of it what you will.
He also had a take on who murdered Naomi, didn't he?
He did have a take on who murdered Naomi. He thought that it was Morris, the brother-in-law, as the cops thought at the time. The family story that's gone down all these years, he seemed to agree with. And I was surprised by how relieved I felt when he actually said that, in the sense that I don't believe anything that the psychic mediums say, but as soon as he said that, I thought, oh, thank God, because it's an easier thing for the family to swallow and potentially makes my life a lot easier. So in that instant, I understood why it is that people put their trust in psychic mediums, because even though they might not get credible answers, there could be some comfort. And then your logical brain kicks in and you don't allow yourself any more comfort about that. But for those few split seconds, I could totally understand what it was all about.
Do you feel closure now about who did it? Do you feel like you know for sure who was responsible for the death of your wife's great-grandmother?
I cannot know for sure. There is some residual doubt for me. There are bits of convincing evidence on both sides. I have a belief about what I know, but I don't know for sure. I guess that I'm accepting of what it means to not know that answer, because for so long during this story, it's driven me crazy, lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about things over and over and over again. I think I pretty much know, but I'm okay with the, 25, 30% that I can't be certain about. I'm at peace with that. It's okay. And being able to let go of stuff, that's been the most important lesson for me while making this show. We've met so many people along the way, and I feel like the people that we've met who seem most content, who have less stuff weighing on them, are the people who are able to let go of things and accept the idea that they're not going to know for sure, and to be okay with that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And the questions that you've had since this podcast has come out, I feel like everyone I know listened to this podcast, and it has been the subject of all our conversations. What were you surprised about in terms of the response? What have people asked? What have people said?
I guess, first of all, I've been really intrigued by the number of quite smart questions people have had about just the mechanics of the murder. There are a few questions that have come up over and over again. One of them is that people really want to know more about Naomi and Morris. So it's been really fun kind of engaging with people about those questions. I think the thing that's touched me most has been the people who've contacted me to say that listening to the show has helped them to feel better about unreconciled things in their own family past, including, my own aunt on my father's side of the family, who contacted me and said that, she'd always had questions about the life of my grandfather, her father. And, I think he was another man who has a sort of slightly obscure history, and, we don't know everything about his past. And she told me that listening to the story of Father and Naomi made her more accepting of the things she didn't know about her own father. So that was really important to me. I've been very touched by the number of people who've been very moved by the story of Naomi and who she really was, and kind of bringing her back into the family story. That's really meant a lot to me. It's been great.
And finally, I wanted to ask about your relationship with your in-laws. What's it like now? Is anyone still a bit pissed off?
I would say that, broadly speaking, the Danceys have been, massively patient with me, and, they didn't ask for any of this. It's been uncomfortable for them a lot of the time. Like, nobody wants to feel like they're under the microscope, and in an extremely public fashion, as this has been for them. They didn't need to spend hours and hours and hours talking to me about this. They could have just said, no, sorry, we don't want to do that. So I have enormous respect for them for having done it. I'd say some of the family have enjoyed the end product more than others. And the discussions about like what my motivations were and whether I did a good job are ongoing with some members of the family. And we're agreeing to disagree on a few things. But generally speaking, like, I could not have been luckier with the family that I married into. They're a pretty amazing bunch. Not everyone would have put up with this.
Yeah, a very interesting family indeed. Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to season 2, 3, 4, 5 and on.
And no promises, but if we can conjure up some more stories on this kind of basis, then we certainly will. We'd love to do some more of it because it's been so much fun to make. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, who do you think did it? I think the murder is pretty clear to me, but one of the most interesting parts of the story is the question of ancestry. How much does who we come from inform our sense of who we are? How important are the stories that we tell about long gone relatives? And does it even matter if they're true? If this story has affected you in any way, please call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. You heard a few snippets, but to listen to Tristan's full 7-part podcast, Ghost Story, just click the link in the show notes. Or you might want to listen to our Mamma Mia podcast, True Crime Conversations, which explores the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Check that out also via the link in the show notes. Jessie Stevens was the person that you heard interviewing Tristan Redman. The executive producer of No Filter is Kimberly Bradish, with sound production by Maddie Joannou. I'm Mia Friedman. Thanks for listening.